Hi again then guys, and welcome to another Special Projects custom build, and this is one of those builds which, although technically it's not real, it very easily could be real, and it's kind of a requested tune as well. It was a tune which I thought I'd built and put out quite a while back, but apparently not, because when it came to the request I checked it out and I hadn't put the tune out. So this is a Type R style build, the iconic, of course, Type R range from Honda, but for the CRZ hybrid. Perhaps not an obvious choice of Type R, but at the same time it could work, considering that you have the added advantage of that hybrid system to kick in and help you, where in a normal Type R you wouldn't necessarily have that. So we'll go out in just a second to find what it's like around an actual racetrack to see if it can cut it as a Type R. But first of all, of course, we have the build. Now, as far as the visuals, I've gone for the optional body kit and the small optional rear wing. There's no real need to go over to the visual tuning garage because it's a very simple setup to get. As far as the rims, I've gone for Oz Ultra Legeras. They're pretty far down the list of rims, and I've gone for those in the inch up 1 size. They look fairly similar to the kind of rims which you'd see on, for instance, a DC5 Integra Type R. Not exactly the same, of course, but fairly similar. And as far as the colour, of course, I've gone for Championship White, which is the colour of the Type R Hondas. And of course you could go for whatever colour you want, but that's just the colour that I've gone for both the body and the rims. We haven't painted the brakes because those are still stock. Obviously if you upgrade those, then that will apply. So that's it for the visuals. Now let's go over to the mechanical side of things. Now, of course, as I've mentioned before, there are a couple of advantages, very significant ones in fact, to making a custom tune rather than a replica. For one thing, you've got more creative freedom. You don't need to build it in the way that I have. You can totally change it up if you believe the car would have had more power or less power, more weight or less weight, and also you can just totally retool the car and respec it and retune it for different purposes. Maybe you want to have it at the 400 pp level, maybe the 450 pp level, or maybe as it is at 425. Maybe you want less than 200 horsepower, which, all things considered, the real car probably would have a little bit less, maybe around 180, 190. Maybe you think it should be a bit lighter, maybe just under a ton. But that's down to you, and that's the beauty of the tune. Now, I've gone for sports hards, which you could say is overkill, but I wanted it to be a bit uprated over the standard tyres. As I said, I haven't upgraded the brakes because, again, you want it to feel like a legitimate street car. As far as suspension, as you can see, of course, we have upgraded that. We've lowered the ride height by about 20 or so mil to 130. Springs I've just increased a little bit to 350 and 250, which is still a notable difference compared to stock. Dampers and anti-roll I've lowered to 2, which again is still higher than the stock values. The suspension has a little bit of roll to it, but again, it is better than the normal CRZ, and again, you don't want it to corner like a full-on touring car or like a race car of any kind, because it needs to look like a road car and feel like a road car through the corners as well. So that's why I did that. As far as camber and toe, as usual, I haven't got any. If you want to have some, you can, but it's just not really necessary on this car. As far as the gearbox, you could upgrade it, and most people probably will choose to, but I've opted not to, mainly due to the audio. Of course, as I've mentioned before, when you upgrade to a race gearbox, you get that distinctive whine, which comes from those straight cut gears. So I've opted not to do that, but instead to keep it stock, and also with the stock gearbox you do get a smoother gear change. But again, it's down to personal preference. As far as the diff, I've gone for the lowest initial torque, highest acceleration and braking, but as always, it's very much down to personal preference, and the diff is a very personalisable thing. What works for one person won't work for somebody else, especially with a front-wheel drive car. Now, as far as power, we do have an oil change, so you need to bear that in mind as far as how much power you plan to have in the car. But I've gone for the Stage 3 engine tune, as you can see, sports computer, manifold, cat, and intake tuning, but no exhaust and no turbo. Then I've reduced it down to 200 horsepower, and as far as weight, I wanted to drop it by a legitimate amount. Not ridiculously light, but at the same time lighter than the stock CRZ. We've dropped it by about 80 kilos over the 1130 of the standard car, and to do that I've gone for stage 2 weight reduction, and although technically you can get that by just doing stage 1, the reason why I wanted to do with stage 2 and ballast is so that I can then put that ballast to the back of the car and slightly improve the weight distribution. So if you're not bothered about that, you don't need to, otherwise I would recommend it. And incidentally, we are, as you can see, running the maximum downforce, though it doesn't really make a huge difference, so you don't really technically need to do that. But that's it for what I've done for the tune, and as I said, there's tons of room for personal variation with a tune like this. So all that remains is to, of course, take it out to a racetrack, in this case Suzuka, to see what it can do. Now, as I mentioned, of course, one of the things that I wanted to accomplish with this car, apart from being a believable build, is at the same time not to feel too good. Now, as far as cornering, some people may not like the setup that I'm using. That's fair enough. As I said, in particular the diff and suspension on a front-wheel drive car will totally change what one person likes compared to somebody else. You may find it a little bit too understeery through corners, a bit too heavy in effect, maybe a bit too much torque steer, but of course you can change settings to counteract that to some degree, but at the same time it's definitely not as heavy as it easily could be with different settings. Overall, the handling is sharper than the normal CRZ. It's not race car level, and we don't want it to be, and in terms of lap time, at the end of the day, it does have 200 horsepower, but it's still only a 425 pp car, so you could potentially use it for, say, seasonal events, which very rarely come up at that level, or, more importantly, online racing at that level, or you could just totally rebuild it for another level, say 400, 450, whatever. But overall, I hope you find it fun, and of course you can check out more builds like this in the playlist at the end of this video. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.